If you wish to make progress, then be content to appear senseless and foolish in externals. Do not make it your wish to give the appearance of knowing anything. And if some people think you to be an important personage, distrust yourself. For be assured that it is no easy matter to keep your moral purpose in a state of conformity with nature and at the same time to keep externals. But the man who devotes his attention to one of these two things must inevitably neglect the other. In chapter 13 of the Enchiridion, Epictetus is reminding us of a choice that inevitably we have to make. And we don't really have a choice about whether we want to make this choice. It's just about which direction we're going to go with it, and if we confuse ourselves or mislead ourselves about being able to have things both ways. So the two terms of the choice, you could say, the two options, are on the one hand what he's calling externals, to ektos, the things that are outside of our control, but which we often view as goods, and so long as we mistakenly view them as goods for ourselves, or indeed even the good, our desire is naturally going to be attracted to them, and insofar as we see them as bad things, or their deprivation is bad, then we're going to feel a sense of aversion towards them. And that's one side. The other side is having our moral purpose or our faculty of choice, what it is that we really are at our core, in accordance with nature. And let's remind ourselves, too, that this doesn't mean nature as in, what we observe human beings to be doing all the time when we see people acting badly and we say, oh, it's just human nature. What we're talking about here is a fully developed, a fully realized, a fundamentally good human nature that is really what we're all hankering for, striving for, but often getting wrong in the process. And Epictetus is telling us, look, you can focus on one of these or you can focus on the other, but you can't focus on both. And if you tell yourself that you're going to focus on both and somehow it's going to all work out, you're really deceiving yourself and setting yourself up for problems. So he gives us three bits of advice about how we would put this into practice. Those are the things that follow after he says, if you wish to make progress, then these are the things you have to accept. He says, be content to appear senseless and foolish in externals. So what does that mean? Be all right with other people, and even perhaps yourself when you engage in self-recrimination, saying, yeah, that just was not the right thing to do. If you wanted to maximize your income, why were you focusing on this, Stoic philosophy and its exercises? If your goal was to, as Dale Carnegie said, make friends and influence people, or if you wanted to, get the corner office, if you wanted to get this, if you wanted all these things that are external to us, or even think about your body, because the body is something external for Epictetus. If you wanted to be stylish, then why did you not find out what the current style was? All those things, or the lack of those things, is what makes people appear to other people, and perhaps even to themselves if they internalize that, to be foolish, to not manage their externals well. If you really think, though, like the Stoics do, that externals are indifferent, they're neither good nor bad, then why would you put all that attention, say, into style, or design, or making a ton of money, or this or that, all these things that are external? You wouldn't do that. So if you're going to try to make progress, you've got to learn how to be okay with people saying, that person doesn't have it all together. They're not doing what they need to do if their goal is X, because the Stoics' goal is not that. The Stoics' goal is having their moral purpose or faculty of choice in accordance with nature. The next one that he says is, do not make it your wish to give the appearance of knowing anything. So this isn't just a matter of, putting on airs and trying to appear to be more knowledgeable than you actually are. If you're studying Stoic philosophy and you've read some Epictetus, you actually do know something. And if you're paying attention to how it pans out when you put it into practice and how other people act and it functions as a lens, you actually do know something. But that doesn't mean that you need to tell other people that you know it. And it doesn't even mean that it would be productive for you to tell other people that you know something. Again, you may know something, they may not recognize that. If you try to make an issue of that and show them how they've got things fundamentally wrong and are being irrational, are engaging in sort of self-contradiction, are being inconsistent, all of those sorts of things, that is not going to be a message that they can hear until they're receptive to hearing it. And that may be never, depending on who the person is. So you don't have to make an issue out of knowing anything. And as a matter of fact, you should probably learn how to be okay with other people saying, that guy really doesn't know anything. Again, the evidence for that would be, well, he's not, doing the sorts of things that the rest of us are doing, which is really not a good criterion for whether you know something or not. The third thing that he says builds off of all of this. He says, if some people think you to be an important personage, distrust yourself. Now, that's a very interesting bit of advice. Is he talking about, you getting celebrity status or having lots and lots of Facebook friends and people liking your witty statements or your political observations or whatever else it is? Or is he talking about other people trusting you with authority and then people looking up to you because of that? Is he talking about having talents that you've developed and other people saying, that person really has done a lot, I want to be like them? Well, it could be any of those cases. It could even be making progress in Stoic philosophy, right? Although that's probably a little less likely to be put on a pedestal than, say, athletic prowess or business acumen, or whatever else we want to say that our culture celebrates. Now, there is something to that. When other people who are primarily looking at externals and are not paying attention to their, the basis of their personality, the core of who they are, and whether it's in good shape or bad shape, and whether they would like to fix it or work on it. And if they're not actually doing that wholeheartedly, but they're paying primarily attention to externals, they're bad judges. And so if they think that you're really doing well, from a Stoic perspective, that should set off some red flags or some alarm bells. If they're thinking that you're doing really great, either it's totally indifferent and you're not doing great necessarily at all, or you're actually doing the wrong things. If you wind up making a ton of money, well, that's not a bad thing or a good thing. Maybe you just happen to be in the right place at the right time. Maybe the things that you did, with integrity were rewarded, although that's very often not the case. It's usually the opposite. Or maybe you followed the crowd. Maybe you gave into the culture. Maybe you cut yourself off from making progress along the Stoic path. There's also a tendency that we ought to think about here that I think Epictetus is hinting at, which is when other people are making a lot of us, when they're telling us, oh, you're such a swell guy, oh, you're so invaluable, oh, you are really a go-getter, you're the best scholar, whatever it happens to be. It's easy for us, if we're not already totally, at the end of the Stoic path as the sage, it's easy for us to find our desires and aversions that are still hooked out in things out there in the world, particularly in how other people think about us, to start getting swayed by that and to ignore the fact that there should be a little voice in the back of our head saying, watch out. It's easy to start ignoring that and say, well, in this case, maybe they actually are right. And Epictetus is saying, look, if you're going to pursue the Stoic path, it's got to be 100% commitment, or else it's going to fail. Sooner or later, you're going to get dragged back into external things. So he says, be assured, it's no easy matter to keep your moral purpose in a state of conformity with nature, and at the same time to keep externals. You can maintain one, or you can maintain the other. If you try to maintain both, and there's plenty of externals that would tell you can maintain both, right? You can have it all. You're going to lose all of it. Or at best, you're going to get the externals. You're definitely not going to find the contentment, the tranquility, the not being hindered, the happiness that lies along the Stoic path, because you're not going to bring your moral purpose in accordance with nature. So he says, the person who devotes his attention to one of these two things must inevitably neglect the other. So if it really is the case that one does have to neglect the other one, you have to choose wisely. And most importantly, you have to actually make a choice.
If you make it your will that your children and your wife and your friends should live forever, you are silly, for you are making it your will that things not under your control should be under your control, and that what is not your own should be your own. In the same way, too, if you make it your will that your slave boy be free from faults, you are a fool, for you are making it your will that vice be not vice, but something else. If, however, it is your will not to fail in what you desire, this is in your power. Wherefore exercise yourself in that which is in your power. Each man's master is the person who has the authority over what the man wishes or does not wish, so as to secure it or take it away. Whoever therefore wants to be free, let him neither wish for anything, nor avoid anything that is under the control of others, or else he is necessarily a slave.
Chapter 14 confronts us with some of our irrational desires, and going beyond that, the word that he uses here is not just desire like erexes, but the verb theles, to choose, to will, to want something to be a certain way. So there's the element of desiring, and then there's also the element of choosing or committing. And he talks about several different things that it's fundamentally wrong-headed to desire or to wish things to be that way. He says, if you make it your will that your children and your wife and your friends should live forever, you're being silly. Why is that the case? Well, remember, the Stoics were materialists, so they're not talking about some soul going off to an afterlife or anything like that. So if we confine ourselves just to bodily existence, if you expect that any given person, people that you do feel affection for, is going to live forever, you're really being kind of crazy. You're expecting things to be different in your case than they are for all the rest of humanity, past, present, and presumably future. So it's setting yourself up for not only failure and disappointment, but great heartbreak if you don't, take account of the fact that your wife, your spouse, your husband, your children, your parents, friends, whoever else that you're attached to, is going to eventually encounter death. If you're going to deny that or pretend like that's not the case, it's going to happen. Either they'll die before you, or they'll die after you, in which case it's not really an issue. But if they do die before you, what are you gonna do when you have to deal with it? He says, you're making it your will that things not under your control should be under your control, and that what is not your own should be your own. So this is a very important application of that fundamental distinction between what is in our control or in our power and what is not. What is our own task or our own business and what isn't. You could say that it's okay to hope, perhaps, in some sense, realizing that those hopes are not going to be real, are not going to come to any fruition, that one will live forever, or one's parents or children or spouse or friends will live forever. But the Stoics would say that that's rather misguided. That sort of hope is not based in anything. And this is where the Stoics are going to differ from quite a few other philosophical and also theological traditions. If we're going to be consistent about how to approach things that are not in our power, this is an example of things that we just can't allow ourselves to wish for. And if we do find ourselves wishing for it, then we need to go through a process of figuring out, well, why is it that I want things to be other than I know them to be? Why is it that I want things so badly to be an exception to the general rule? And it's understandable in the case of death why that would be the case. But understanding that doesn't change the situation. He goes on and he says, in the same way too, if you make it your will that your slave boy be free from faults, you're a fool. That's a foolish thing to do. Foolish in the sense of being the opposite of wisdom. Why is it a foolish thing to wish your servant, or really anything else that we might talk about that's in a subordinate position, to be free of faults? Well, to start with, are you free of faults? You're in a higher position, and you're not even free of faults. Do you actually know anybody who's free of faults, who never makes mistakes, who never misinterprets what's going on, who doesn't say stupid things from time to time, who doesn't trip occasionally? Well, you're expecting that the things that are beneath you are going to do that, or the things that are subordinated to you in some way. Why would that possibly be the case? I think for a lot of us today, it's not just in terms of the people that we deal with. Most of us don't have servants, but we do have people who are placed in a subordinate position, oftentimes temporarily, in relation to us, like clerks in retail stores, or customer service workers, or people who are on the tech support line. But we do have technology. And don't we often get upset with our technology when it's not doing things the way that we expect it to? I mean, by this point in time, if we're going solely by induction, by taking our range of experiences and generalizing from them, we should probably say when it comes to any given computer, it's probably going to screw up sooner or later, right? When it comes to any given phone, it's going to lose its signal sooner or later. When it comes to any software upgrade, it's probably going to damage some things and send some functions haywire. We shouldn't be so unrealistic about how things are going to perform. Those are things that are not in our power. In this case, he talks about the slave boy, and he says, you're making it your will that vice be not vice, but something else. We could apply this to so many other things as well. Think about family members or friends who, in one way or another, are irrational about something. It could be politics, it could be about sports, it could be how they treat other people, it could be, about their life narrative and, how they portray themselves and other people. If they really are off base in things, you're not going to be able to, steer them onto base unless they decide at some point, oh, wow, my gosh, I'm so screwed up. I don't want to be screwed up like this. I need to take some steps. And then you've actually got some opening, some leverage, some room where, Stoic philosophy or other, approaches could take root. But until then, so long as they're, established in that, if you're expecting irrationality not to appear to be irrational, if you're expecting people who, fly off the handle at a given situation to not fly off the handle, if you're expecting somebody who you know to be a coward to actually stick up for you and have your back, that's foolishness. You're expecting things to be totally other than they are. And you can say, yeah, but I'd like them to be that way. Sure, you can like them to be that way, and then you're being irrational, and that's just as bad as the other person who's being irrational, isn't it? So he goes on with this, and he says, if, however, it is your will not to fail in what you desire, this is in your power. The Stoics teach that if we can confine our desires and our aversions to what really is in our control, then we will never fail, right? Unless we choose to fail. If we're going to desire all sorts of things that are dependent upon another person, that are dependent on the stars aligning just right, that are dependent on the technology not letting us down, we're bound to be disappointed. And we should recognize that. So he goes on and he says, wherefore, exercise yourself in that which is in your power. Now here's where he says something really quite interesting. Each man's master is the person who has authority over what the man wishes or does not wish, so as to secure it or to take it away. What is it to be in charge, to be a master, to be in control? It's to have power over the things that other people desire. Now, if your desires are primarily oriented around being a good person, having your personality squared away, working upon yourself, what Epictetus calls the realm of the proiresis or the moral purpose, nobody else has control over that. You have control over that. That's the central message of Stoic philosophy. You control the core of your person. You control what you want to make of yourself. What other people think about it, that's up to them. That's not in your control. That will never be in your control, except insofar as you can bring power to bear upon them. If you want them to think a certain way, find out what, sort of levers you have, and then, start pulling on those levers. But realize that you're essentially being pulled on by other levers in doing that yourself. It's better that you don't worry so much about how to get other people to do what you want and focus on actually getting you to do what it is that you recognize as good for you, as a way of improving yourself, a way of pruning away those bad parts of yourself that are causing you grief, that are causing you disappointment, that are causing you unhappiness, that are getting you into conflicts with other people, with yourself. It's better that you work on that than that you worry about what somebody else thinks or what somebody else does or whether it's fair or whether, they shot first or any of these sorts of things. Because you don't have control over any of that. And so Epictetus goes on and he says, whoever wants to be free, let him neither wish for anything nor avoid anything that's under the control of others. So if you want to be free, then you probably can't care an awful lot about the fashion industry. Because the fashion industry is under the control of others. Even if you manage to break in, most of the time what you're dealing with are other people's ideas, other people's preferences, other people's pushing, other people's pulling. If it's politics, now that's not to say that the Stoics would say withdraw from politics, but there are ways to behave as a good politician, somebody with integrity. Most politicians don't. Most politicians haven't throughout history. A lot of people get involved in politics because they think they're going to fix the world. They're going to make things better, at least in their own little corner. And then they find out all the wheeling and dealing and all the people pleasing that they have to do and the loss of integrity that goes along with that. If you're going to buy into that sort of system, be prepared to be disappointed, especially in political races, because only one candidate can win, right? And even when they win, they often lose, don't they? And we could go on and on and on. If your goal is accumulating romantic relationships, that's highly dependent on somebody else, isn't it? If your goal is to amass a ton of money or to be perfectly secure in terms of finances, in terms of prepping or hoarding weapons, or making sure that nobody can do anything that could possibly harm you, you can certainly spend a lot of time on that, but that's not actually going to make you happy from the Stoic perspective, because all those things are dependent on somebody else. Oftentimes not just on somebody else, but on some things else. But so long as, to go back to that thing, so long as somebody has control over it, you don't have control over it. And so if you want to be happy, you have to be realistic about the way things are, and you have to confine your desires and aversions and choices to what it is that you really do have control over.
Remember that you ought to behave in life as you would at a banquet. As something is being passed around, it comes to you. Stretch out your hand and take a portion of it politely. It passes on. Do not detain it. Or it has not come to you yet. Do not project your desire to meet it, but wait until it comes in front of you. So act towards children, so toward a wife, so toward office, so toward wealth, and then someday you will be worthy of the banquets of the gods. But if you do not take these things even when they are set before you, but despise them, then you will not only share the banquet of the gods, but share also their rule. For it was by so doing that Diogenes and Heraclitus and men like them were deservedly divine and deservedly so called.
Epictetus likes metaphors, and he uses one here in chapter 15 that's particularly striking. He talks about being at a banquet. And now this is presuming that you actually do have some decent table manners, that you have some understanding about how to comport yourself in public at common meals. But here's what he says. He says, you ought to behave in life as you would at a banquet. So that doesn't mean stuffing your face and getting drunk and falling under the table or anything like that. He says, as something is being passed around, it comes to you. Stretch out your hand, take a portion of it politely. It passes on. Do not detain it. So, you don't necessarily have to think of a banquet. Think of a family meal. Here come the mashed potatoes. I love mashed potatoes. I've been waiting for the mashed potatoes. Do you dig in and take all the mashed potatoes and then just pass on an empty bowl to the next person and say, oops, sorry, it's all gone now. I had my turn. No, you take a polite amount, and if you really like the mashed potatoes, hopefully there will be enough for seconds. If there aren't enough for seconds, let it go, right? Because that's what it's like to be good in a situation with others. And you might say, well, wait a second, aren't the Stoics supposed to not care about what other people think? You're not supposed to make your happiness dependent upon what other people think, or allow your desires and aversions to get entangled with that. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to care at all what other people think. Why would you deliberately hurt somebody else's feelings? Why would you behave in an uncaring way towards them? That's not to have your proairesis or moral faculty in a state of accordance with nature. That's actually against nature. Although, you can say, well, that's human nature. Yes, that's damaged, bestial human nature. That's not developed human nature, which is what you ought to be striving for. So he says, it has not come to you yet. Do not project your desire to meet it, but wait until it comes in front of you. Now, this is a metaphor about the table, right? But you could think about how this would apply in so many other cases. Don't always be thinking about how you're going to advance in your career. Actually do the work at the time that will result, perhaps, if things work out right, in you advancing in your career. Because if you're spending all your time daydreaming about the corner office, or about getting, more accounts, or about, when you're going to make full professor, or things like that, you're never going to do any real work. You can't just plan all day long, right? And we can say this about so many other things as well. And we can say this about ourselves as projects. Oh, when I lose 50 pounds, then life is going to begin. We used to say something like that in the Army, which was quite strange. We'd say, when I get back to the world, or sometimes we'd say, when I get back to the real world. And I remember one time, a sergeant saying, "What is wrong with you, dummy? You're in the real world right now. This is it. It could be over now." And we can say similarly about all these other things. That's what it is to allow the dishes to pass and not extend our desire out to them, but only allow it to come out when the dish is in front of us. So he says, act in this way towards children, towards a wife, towards office, towards wealth, and someday you will be worthy of the banquets of the gods. But if you do not take these things, even when they're set before you, but look down upon them, the translation has despise them, but it just means to look down upon them, then you will not only share the banquet of the gods, but also share their rule. If you want to have the kind of life that people look to and say, that person, nobody can coerce them. They are in control of themselves, in control of their emotions. They do what they want to do because they want something that's realistic. That's something that's feasible, but that requires, like he says, that we don't take these things even when they're before us. Why wouldn't we take them when they're before us? Well, because that's one way to practice the virtues that are required for a fully Stoic life, like fortitude, like endurance, like wisdom, like justice. And he goes on and he gives us some interesting examples. He says, it was by doing so that Diogenes and Heraclitus and men like them were deservedly divine and deservedly so called. Diogenes was the Cynic philosopher who, actually mouthed off even to an emperor. That's a lot of freedom right there. Now, the way that he secured that freedom was by living in a barrel and doing what he wanted in the marketplace and putting up with people beating him up every once in a while. But that might be the cost of it. Heraclitus, we don't actually know quite so much about as they did in ancient times, because in part his writings are only present to us in fragments. We have a life of Heraclitus. But Heraclitus similarly had lived a life of freedom from convention, of freedom from the oppressive weight of social pressure. And so if we behave, like he says, the way that one ought to at a banquet, and we apply this to our desiring and our thinking about things and our feeling about things, we will be setting ourselves up for freedom and for happiness.